On February 9, 2012, almost 2 years after the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act was passed, FDA has released draft guidelines concerning the regulatory path for biosimilars. This is Amy Ritter, Scientific Editor at BioPharm International, and today we have Dr. Howard Levine, President and Principal Consultant of Bioprocess Technology Consultants, based in Woburn, Massachusetts, in the U.S. Dr. Levine will be joining us today to help examine these documents and to discuss what they mean for developers of biosimilars. Dr. Levine, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So what's your overall take-home message regarding the recent FDA draft guidelines on scientific and quality considerations around biosimilars? And how do you think they compare and contrast with the EMA guidelines?
I think, first of all, this is a very positive and big step forward for development of biosimilar products in the U.S. These guidelines have been anxiously awaited by industry for almost a year now, so it's nice to see them finally come out. As far as the guidelines themselves are concerned, they do seem to be very similar to the current guidelines in Europe. They follow very closely along the lines of the EU law. However, there are a few differences between the U.S. guidance and the current EU regulations, some of which are favorable to developers of biosimilars in the U.S., and some of which actually are much less favorable than the EU law. The BPCI Act was passed in 2009, as you noted, and since that time, obviously, there have been no biosimilar submissions or approvals in the U.S. until the guidelines were put out. We now have a pathway, the so-called 351K pathway, which is the biosimilar application, and it provides, as I said, several both advantages and disadvantages over the current guidelines for biosimilar development in the EU.
Is there anything new or surprising about the guidelines?
Not necessarily surprising. I think FDA has been telegraphing what was going to be in these guidelines for some time now. They've been making presentations throughout last year at various industry conferences. They also published several articles over the last year that talked about their approach to the development of guidelines for biosimilars. I think one of the most positive aspects of the guidance is something that FDA has been talking about for a while now, and that is their totality of evidence approach, and that is that they will look at the approval of biosimilars as a compilation of all of the evidence and characterization that a company has developed for a particular molecule. What this means is that there will obviously be extensive characterization of the biosimilar product using, as FDA refers to, state-of-the-art analytical techniques. However, even with the detailed characterization, biochemical and biophysical characterization, there may still be a need for animal studies in some cases, but human clinical trials will obviously always be required for a biosimilar.
So, I mean, given what you just said, do you think that developers will be able to be fairly flexible in how they characterize? So will they be able to use cutting-edge technologies? Will they be sort of pigeonholed into a standard set of analytics that FDA would like to see?
No, I think FDA will once again rely on their standard case-by-case approach as far as what analytical characterization is required. But obviously they will be looking to have as extensive a characterization of the molecule as possible using the most up-to-date state-of-the-art techniques that are currently available, just as they actually are for new innovator products. This is not really any different than the requirement for characterization of a new product. The difference, of course, is that one must demonstrate comparability or biosimilarity to an existing reference product rather than simply providing the characterization data for a new product.
So do you think that these guidelines will clarify any interesting opportunities or challenges for developers?
Um, they will actually have some, as I said, some advantages and some disadvantages. I think one of the biggest advantage of the new guidance is the allowance of a non-U.S. reference standard for clinical trials. In the EU, the reference standard that's used to compare a biosimilar must be an EU-approved product. What this allows, what FDA has done has allowed the use, for example, of European reference standards for approval of a biosimilar in the U.S. This is really a very, very good news for companies developing biosimilars, because if they have clinical trials already underway in Europe, for example, using a European reference standard, those clinical trials don't necessarily have to be repeated, provided that they can show that the reference standard is an acceptable one for the U.S. submission. Likewise, for companies who haven't started their clinical development, they can put together a clinical program that encompasses both the EU and the U.S., again, by incorporating an EU reference standard.
So that's obviously a nice bit of flexibility built into the guidelines. Can you talk a little bit about what the biggest challenges will be for developers?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost challenge from the technical standpoint is demonstrating biosimilarity from a biochemical and biophysical perspective. We've seen a lot of talks by FDA as well as by people in industry showing what they believe are comparable or similar products. The real question is, as has been the case in the EU, how similar is similar? One expects that there will be minor differences in, for example, glycosylation patterns or the extent of deamidation, for example, in a monoclonal antibody product. One expects that there will be slight differences between the biosimilar and the innovator product. The question is how much of those differences, how large a difference will be acceptable for the product to still be deemed biosimilar. The other challenges for developing biosimilars in the U.S. are not necessarily technical challenges. They're more business and regulatory, if you will. First of all, there is the 12-year data exclusivity period, which means that a biosimilar product in the U.S. cannot come to market until 12 years after the reference product or innovator product was first approved. This generally isn't a problem because the patents usually extend beyond that 12-year period, but it could be a problem in a case where a patent may expire earlier than this 12-year exclusivity period. The biosimilar company would be precluded from selling their product until the end of that 12-year period. The second challenge for biosimilar companies, again, more from a business and legal perspective than a technical or scientific one, is the requirement that the biosimilar company must disclose their entire dossier to the reference product company to review. This could prompt very frequent and lengthy patent and IP litigation, which could be very costly and could in the long run hold up the approval of biosimilar products.
So to discuss yet a further challenge, let's talk a little bit about interchangeability. I mean, obviously
Yes.
this is a big win if you can prove it. What do you see are the challenges around proving it, and do you think it will be a pathway that people will really be able to take advantage of?
Achieving interchangeability is going to be extremely difficult. First of all, at the moment, the guidance, other than saying that FDA will consider interchangeability after one has demonstrated biosimilarity, other than that mention, there really is no discussion as to what the requirements for demonstrating interchangeability might be. However, if one looks back to the original BPCI Act, the bar for interchangeability is extremely high and may actually be impossible to meet, because the BPCI Act actually says that one must, in order to achieve interchangeability, you have to ensure that the molecule will behave the same as the innovator product in every patient. and achieving that from a scientific perspective may actually be difficult, if not impossible.
As far as timeline, how long do you think it will be before there will be a significant number of biosimilars in the U.S.? A year, 5 years, 10 years?
I think part of it will depend on how quickly it takes for these draft guidelines to become finalized and approved, because I don't think we'll see an approval until the guidance has been approved. But FDA, by their own releases, said that they have already had discussions with, I believe, 9 companies regarding biosimilar applications. They have several other meetings pending. So there's obviously been a lot of activity behind the scenes, if you will, of companies approaching FDA even before the guidelines were published. I think that the first wave of biosimilars that we see in the U.S. will most likely be those products that are already on the market as biosimilars in Europe. Again, the fact that the clinical trial requirements for biosimilar under the new guidelines allow for a non-U.S. reference product means that those products that are currently on the market in Europe companies should be able to submit their clinical and post-market data against that European reference standard, and it should be acceptable in a submission to FDA. So what that means is really compiling the data and putting together the appropriate application and submitting the application without actually having to run any clinical trials. So those will probably be the first products approved. I would expect to see them approved, the first of them approved within the first year after the guidance is finalized. And then obviously beyond that, we'll begin to see new biosimilar products that are not yet on the market in Europe.
So once the guidelines actually do become finalized, what do you expect to see next from FDA?
Well, they have promised a guideline on interchangeability, so that would obviously be one thing we would watch for. It'll also be interesting to see what, if any, changes there are in the guidance between this current draft version and the final version. The document is open for public comment at the moment. I know that several of our clients, as well as other companies that I've spoken to at conferences and such, are planning to submit comments to FDA. So the question is really how long will it take them to compile all those comments and revise and update the draft before they release it as final.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Levine, for your insights and your opinions, and I look forward to exploring this topic with you in the future as biosimilars come to market and we know more about them.
You're welcome. We're all anxiously awaiting to see what the next steps might be.